Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on colonial medicine. This particular topic, of course, is and should be very near and dear to us, as we are former colonial people in the West Indies, and we're going to be talking about the impact of the Western medical tradition on colonial territories and really the association with the imperialist agenda largely. So imperialism really has had a major impact on the development of public health systems in both colonial societies and imperial centers, or mother countries as we call them. We all note, of course, the impact of the Columbian Exchange. We've done the Renaissance in this course, and we spoke about the exchange, the uneven exchange of diseases, for example. And of course, it's had a major impact, just the introduction of the New World into the world systems, right? Those connections, those exchanges, the influences on both ends, of course, is going to advance medicine, but also undermine to a certain extent, or should I say to a large extent, what was found in colonial centers and indigenous societies. So public health as well is going to be further complicated by enslavement, immigration, movement of people for labor, and just increased amount of interaction, increased morbidity, mortality, overpopulation, and of course, various other things. So today, our objective is going to be to describe the ways in which Western medicine impacted the colonial world and assess the use of Western medicine as a tool of empire. So this is significant and not often addressed when we speak about medicine. We want to start with understanding the psychology of colonialism, right? And this concept of paternalism that emerged. It came really from the ideology of evolution, right? That was posited by Charles Darwin in his work in 1859 on the origins of species. His theory was influential in establishing this philosophy of colonialism and its connection to race. He argued that all species originated from a common ancestor, and so there was this struggle for survival, and only those with the strongest traits would survive. He posited this theory of natural selection, where, as I said, if on, you had a bark of a tree and different moths, colored moths, and you had the darker colored moths and the lighter colored moths. The ones that could be targeted or would be targeted by prey would be the white colored moths, right? And so they would be picked off. And so over time, you found that more of the darker colored moths would survive, and that trait would be passed on because it was a survival mechanism. And so he argued that this is what occurred in terms of evolution, and that you have the strongest traits being passed on. Of course, the strongest traits tended to equate as well to ethnicity and ethnic traits, unfortunately. And so it became the rationale for colonization, and it had a civilizing function, right? The more evolved race, in the minds of these imperialists with the strongest traits, were morally obligated to help develop those with the weaker traits, right? And of course, those with the weaker traits tended to be people in the colonial world, right? So we see the evolutionary theory underpinning imperialistic agendas and colonialism. So as I said, you have the African, the Asian, the Caribbean people tending to be more subject to this concept of paternalism and racism. They needed to be controlled and taken care of socially and economically, because they're naturally and ethnically inferior, which of course equated to them being lazy, ignorant, and inclined to be unsanitary. So all of these things were brought into this whole concept of spreading medicine. Now, if we look at the early colonial medicine, we're talking early days of the establishment of colonial centers, and European colonial centers in large part. We find that, there were colonial doctors that were involved in that exploration enterprise, right? Adventurers that were hired by pioneers to come, and on every vessel you would have a doctor or a physician. But again, they were coming, yes, in their capacity as medical professionals, but also as adventurers. They would offer medical treatment to European explorers, to missionaries and administrators and their families once things were established in a colony. In every colonial post as well, what we see developing once settlement took place was that they would establish a church, they would establish a school, okay, and also a small infirmary or a hospital. So we have clearly education, religion being of importance, right, within the imperialist system, but also healthcare. And so it actually supports the idea of healthcare being part of the imperialist system, being a tool of empire. Okay, because we see clearly that it was important, they felt it important to establish it within these centers. The colonial medical service later would develop, and in the 19th century, with the rise of tropical medicine, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, you have the creation of colonial medical services. So it moved from simply just having a little infirmary to developing major services with regulatory bodies and systems and a hierarchy. So it became more formalized, right? And so you have European doctors who were officially employed by the imperial government. And you, of course, had local subordinate personnel. So interestingly, as usual, I should say, within the imperialist system, the more dominant positions, the more superior positions were not held by locals, were not held by the indigenous populations, but mostly by European doctors. They were the upper echelons of the medical fraternity, and the local subordinate personnel, they were the ones at the base of this hierarchy involved in lower level activities, right, such as sanitary inspectors. What we also note is the development of the centralized hospital within the colonial medical service. So in the mid-19th century, you would find that, all colonial centers would have their hospitals established, right, and built, or the smaller hospitals would have been rebuilt. There would be this main colonial hospital that would afford training for medical students and nurses, and eventually later on in the 19th century or into the 20th century, they would actually have a training college for nurses, or even develop a medical university. And of course, we saw this happen in the Caribbean, where by the mid 20th century, we have a medical university established, right? So the colonial service developed over time. It became more structured, but at the end of the day, before the independence and decolonization movements, the upper echelons of the system would have been controlled by the Europeans. They would have been part of the medical services, and they would have come into these territories after having been trained, and basically they're in control of the medical system. Okay, again, speaking to how much this was a system and a tool of empire, sending the message that, we are the ones with the knowledge, we are the ones with the power. And you have only the locals really fighting for those positions in the decolonization era, fighting for place. in that era. In terms of nursing, we note that the development, particularly when we look at the British system, we note the emergence of the overseas nursing associations at the end of the 19th century. So we saw during the period of Enlightenment, the development of nursing, the emergence of Florence Nightingale and her influence over nursing. This is going to advance nursing in general and within the colonial centers. And what you found is that a number of women attempted to hone their skills in colonial centers. So they wanted to, go out and, find their way in terms of the nursing profession and begin to understand it. And they felt that the colonial world, right, these colonial theaters, they were the places to go and to work with the indigenous, the poor, and the sick children in these territories. So at the end of the 19th century, you have the nurses associations, the overseas nurses associations developing. They were trained nurses, usually from the upper and middle classes, and they would, provide them with a certificate in nursing and then send them out to work in these colonial centers. So note as well that there were military associations, so they would, have military designations as well. But ultimately, what I'm explaining to you is that within the medical personnel, you have the doctors at the highest level that are European doctors, and the nursing staff as well. They are also Europeans at the matrons, the upper level. So you have control over the system by the Europeans within colonial centers. Okay, so maybe the ward maid would have been the local, but the actual practicing nurses, they would have come from the overseas nursing associations. The development of one particular specialization changed the way that the medical fraternity, that Western medical tradition operated within colonial centers, right? In Asia, in the Caribbean, in Africa, you are going to find, and Australia as well, you're going to find that the development of this particular specialization called tropical medicine in the late 19th century changed the game and put focus on these colonial centers. The objective, of course, was not the health of the indigenous. That was just, a secondary benefit. The objective was the health of the Europeans in the tropics. How do we ensure that they survive? Because, of course, when they came to the tropics, it was difficult for them to survive. Many of them couldn't deal with the heat. There were numerous diseases that they had designated were very prevalent and specific to the tropics that, unfortunately, impacted them specifically. And so they died in large and huge numbers. And so the focus of tropical medicine was to try and to stop this and to protect them. So schools of tropical medicine were opened in Europe as this specialization developed and grew. You have London, Liverpool, Paris, Boston, New Orleans, all opening up schools of medicine, tropical medicine. They are still in existence today, okay? But what is interesting about tropical medicine is that they focus on what they categorized as tropical diseases. But it was interesting that this categorization was very old and is very old. The diseases that were categorized and were lumped into this category of tropical diseases, some of them could be found in European centers and they were very old. So, it's striking that, we can examine this idea of tropical diseases as a specialization, and it speaks to an extent again of them looking down on tropical areas, right? And finding that there are particular diseases that are specific to them. There's no temperate disease category, right? There may be diseases associated, but there's no temperate disease schools, for example, but you'll have a tropical diseases school. Why is that? Why is that? Is it so there's a derogatory kind of association with it that, again, when it comes to medicine, when it comes to anything related to medicine and Western medicine in colonial centers, it's very subtle, but it is there. There's a messaging there that is negative. Okay, so you have things like malaria and yellow fever and sleeping sickness and even plague that could be found in Europe, associated with the tropics now specifically, and tropical diseases, right? And tropical medicine. So if we start to look now and just consider this question of medicine being a tool of empire, and by a tool of empire, I simply mean that it was one of the avenues, one of the approaches, one of the systems that was used to subjugate colonial people, to subjugate indigenous people, and to create satellites of these European territories. That is the argument that we put forward. Just like religion, just like education, it can be seen and evidenced in the operation of the Western medical tradition within these territories. Okay, one example, of course, is that it broke down disease barriers. It made areas penetrable. So even before you were able to advance and invade a territory, your scouts might have already laid waste to villages just by spreading the common cold, sometimes spreading diseases, spreading yellow fever. You know, when we talk, for example, about the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, you have, you know, episodes where the forces are overcome by yellow fever. We also have examples of indigenous people conquered, you know, in the early days of the Columbian exchange, right? The early days of exploration, by diseases. And so it made areas penetrable. It also blocked invasions, but more so, it made areas penetrable. It went before the invaders and actually cleared a path for them. It kept the native workforce healthy. So arguing again that it was a tool of empire, medicine was enforced and implemented to protect the labor force, right? It wasn't about, you know, it wasn't altruistic. It wasn't about protecting them because they were human. It was about making sure that the labor force stayed healthy. So within the enslavement system, you had, you know, a very rudimentary, but you had a health system in place. In terms of indentureship systems in these colonial territories, you would also have, you know, medical systems in place to protect the labor force, right, for the imperialists. And of course, it asserted cultural supremacy, largely because it said, through its messaging, we are superior, we hold the knowledge, we have the power to help and to heal you. And so it said to indigenous people, wow, these people are superior to us. Our systems are inferior. The traditional systems don't work as well. And clearly we're backward and uncivilized. That was the messaging, and therefore asserting cultural supremacy was clearly showed that medicine was used as a tool of empire. How did imperialism actually encourage disease? We also want to note that imperialism and the act of imperialism and the imperialist, you know, movements, particularly when we examine the 16th to the 19th century, clear that their engagement, the imperialist engagement with colonial territories, with colonial people, the travel that was involved, the systems that were built, ensured that disease would spread exponentially. Transportation, steamships, for instance, innovations that allowed people to be transported, and goods to be transported, and animals to be transported, and vermin to be transported. It made transmissions of diseases and vectors of diseases easier. You also have migration of people, right? War, dislocation due to enslavement, contract laborers, indentured laborers. Once they're moving, they're bringing with them whatever diseases they're affected by. We also have the ecological destruction that is taking place within the territories, right? We clearly see that when, for instance, look at the plantation systems in the Caribbean, what they would have done to clear land, for example, they would have cut down trees, gone into forested areas, previously forested areas. They would have cut down the trees, created these estates. They would have channeled irrigation, so changing water courses and so forth. They would have changed the landscape. And of course, that facilitated, more stagnant areas of stagnant water, and created environments where disease vectors could flourish. So when we examine, imperialism and how it encroached on the environment and impacted the environment, we know that that would have led to the spread of the disease as well. We also have military occupations where military men, particularly in terms of sexually transmitted diseases or venereal diseases, that spread would have taken place as well between men who were moving into territories and stationed in various territories for any period of time. So it's clear that imperialism encouraged disease within colonial centers. Now, I often show this picture and ask students what they see. Now, in this online lecture, I'm just going to kind of ask you to take a moment to look at it. So to kind of pause the lecture and to, just reflect on what you're seeing, okay, before we continue. So you should just pause the video right now or stop, take a look at this and see what exactly is it that is, jumping out at you in relation to this image. Who has the power, who doesn't, and why do you think that is? And how this is reflective of, medicine being practiced and the messaging of medicine. So you should stop now and just take a look at it. Okay, so hopefully you stopped and you took a moment to examine the picture and to see what I see and what most people see, where you have doctors clearly of European descent, right, who are dressed in white, and they're clearly dressed in medical attire. They are on a balcony, and it's doctors, as you can see the caption, they're consulting over sleeping sickness in Cameroon. On the outskirts, on the periphery, you have clearly indigenous people, village men and women who are clad in their typical attire, right, which isn't comparable really to what the Europeans are wearing, okay? Their dress looks inferior. It looks as though they aren't even dressed. They look like could possibly, some people would say savages. Look at this group. They're dark-skinned versus the light-skinned. So the juxtaposition here is important to understand. And this was the messaging of the age and the time. Here, these doctors consulting, their backs are turned. They're not in consultation with these people. They're talking about them, making decisions about them. And these people are waiting with bated breath to hear what the doctors have to say. So it's significant when we examine these types of images, and these clearly indicate what, was happening and how medicine was used to advance, the agenda of the imperialists, right? Here's another image. Here you can clearly see who is in authority here, who is the physician, who's the doctor. And this is a picture that is very typical. You have the white European also dressed in white. That's also something that speaks to superiority and civilization, this concept of white versus black, dark versus light. And they're always dressed in white, lily white, right? Bright white. And here you have these indigenous people in dirtier clothing or no clothing at all, okay? But the doctor is clearly European, or maybe it's a later picture and it's American, but this whole imperialist or neo-imperialist concept is playing out. There are people who are also working clearly within the Western medical tradition, operating. You have the clearly a local person, no doubt, usually typically would have been, and he is playing a subordinate role, in a supportive role. He is, probably a lab technician or some kind of some other position that is not the main medical professional on the scene. Okay, and of course the person being dealt with is a local. Okay, so again, we see this juxtaposition, we see who's in charge, we see who is not in charge. Screening on the Ivory Coast, I find this one very interesting as well, because here you can see people of color, right? So this is Africa, and you see clearly that the people who are dressed in European attire, some of them may be white, possibly this man here, but some of them are definitely Black. They are part of the Western medical system. They are part of the new system. And here, this mass of people coming for assistance, right? They're turning to them for help. And yes, of course, they may have advanced systems, they may have advanced help, but again, this is the message that would have been sent to them, that we have the knowledge. I draw your attention to the fact that here these people who are clearly part of the indigenous community, they're born probably and bred there, they're definitely probably African people, but they're now dressed in European garb. They dress the attire of the Western medical professional, right? You're in a hat, you're in a long sleeve jacket or shirt, you're in long pants, and you're in shoes. You are not dressed like you probably formerly were dressed. You are not dressed like the rest of the indigenous people. And I always question why. Why is it that you now have to put on our armor, put on our dress to represent or to do the work in your community? Why couldn't you dress like the people in your community and still do the work? Or even a close approximation. Why does it have to be we're now dressing in light colored clothing? We're now dressing in the attire of the Europeans, okay? Let's talk about some pandemics as well that appeared and impacted the colonial empire, right? And that, ran through this era that we're largely looking at, which is the late 19th century into the 21st century. One of the most significant ones that would have driven activity in colonial centers, and of course around the world, was the cholera pandemic, right? Here you have a quote about the pandemic causing profuse and violent cramps, vomiting and diarrhea, with dehydration so rapid and severe blood thickens and the skin becomes death-like and blue. Cholera victims can die in a matter of hours. This is significant. This was a pandemic tantamount to the COVID pandemic. This was something that changed the way that medicine operated. And from here, we're going to see public health systems developing in rapidly, and of course in the colonial centers as well, investment, quarantine, all sorts of things. Just like we saw with the Black Death, we have this pandemic that affects such change that the world can see itself as before the cholera pandemic and after the cholera pandemic. Right? It wasn't one single outbreak. There were 3 cholera pandemics. Largely, we trace them all, in fact, back to India, 1817 to 1824, 1829 to 1937, and 1846 to 1860. Right? We're talking about deaths nearing 30 million within that period. Right? So the second decade of the 19th century to, a little past mid-19th century, the world would have been plagued by these pandemics. Fatalities could be counted on all major continents: Asia, Africa, South America, the United States, Europe, and inhabited and all of the inhabited territories of the world. The Caribbean in particular, we were affected by the third wave, and it ran through the Caribbean. I don't know how many of you've ever gone to churches, right? Some of the more established churches, the Anglicans and the Catholic churches, and you've seen on the walls where they have their memorials, and you will see, died of cholera, died of the cholera pandemic, as some plaques maybe, or maybe a pew has been donated by a family. Sometimes you'd walk through graveyards in Trinidad or in Tobago or anywhere in the Caribbean, really, and you will see, on the actual gravestone, died from cholera. So this was significant, and it did affect us as well. But cholera was a waterborne disease, and it was so very difficult to understand how it spread, even as the germ theory began to be, put forward. You have them, still believing that it was brought on by miasma, exposure to filth and decay. And so it's actually only in 1855 that Dr. John Snow, he was the British physician that isolated the problem after mapping a London outbreak, right, where they had about close to 11,000 deaths, 10,739 deaths. He connected cholera to contaminated water supply of a single water pump. So there was this water pump that people were using, and they were all using it, and they were just spreading cholera. And so once he identified that, they recognized, oh, this is probably a waterborne disease, and it propelled quarantine legislation and public health policies in a massive way. It is after this that you see hospitals being built, all those colonial hospitals I was telling you about. Port of Spain Colonial Hospital, that is now Port of Spain General Hospital, would have been built in the 1850s. You have San Fernando as well. All of these that would have been colonial hospitals at the time, they were built in the aftermath and in the midst of the drama associated with the cholera pandemic. Okay, the second pandemic, the 20th century pandemic. So we have a major one in the 19th century, a major one in the 20th, and of course, COVID in the 21st. Let's hope that's our only pandemic, right? So the 20th, the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, we're going to look at now, right? It's considered the Spanish flu, and it wasn't a bird flu virus. So there were, again, 3 waves of influenza in this period, and this major pandemic, we know it affected almost every inhabited part of the world. We're still investigating the extent to which it affected the Caribbean. We're talking about 50 million people dying worldwide, right? A third of the world's population was wiped out, 1.6 billion at the time. So, which was 1.6 billion at the time, it was a third of the world's population. So clearly this was deadly, it was swift, it wasn't understood, even though they understood the germ theory at the time. And medicine had advanced to a large extent. You still find them struggling, just as they did with COVID, to get an answer, to figure out, vaccinations and all of those things, which of course were, very much in nascent stages at that time too. There were 2 later waves. About half the deaths were among 20 to 40 years old, which was significant. When your working population, that youth population, that starts to die, that is really significant for society, because unfortunately you expect with any major outbreak, any major pandemic, for you're more vulnerable to pass, the elderly, the young. But when it's attacking those in the prime of their lives, that is when you become scared, because without that group, how does your society survive? It undermines economic productivity, right, and social advancement and so forth. So it was scary for the world. It infected about 500 million people, right? These later waves. Here we have, the extent of it. And of course, you can clearly see how much it would have, it paralleled what happened during COVID-19 for us. The makeshift hospital in the US military would have put up, and this is a factory, right? Or and you found them using, airplane hangars and all sorts of things just to house the sick, to quarantine them. Okay, the influenza epidemic closes schools, churches, and theaters. You know, this is very much what we saw during COVID-19 happening in the 20th century, right? We also know mask wearing was important, and you know, it would, there were prohibitions associated with mask wearing. You couldn't get on to ride the bus, for example, without your mask. And so again, we note what happened during COVID happening in this century as well. They're wearing masks in schools, for instance, right? So significant things took place in relation to the pandemics and driving medicine and driving medical innovations and advancements. Coming off of what was occurring with the cholera pandemic, and then, of course, later on with the Spanish flu, right? The influenza pandemic. International regulatory bodies were developed to help the international community make decisions about work. So no longer was it just this one country and this one country trying to figure it out. They demanded and they asked for an international body that could determine, you know, okay, this is what's happening in the world and this is what countries need to do, and spread that information quickly to kind of curb the spread of diseases and epidemics, and of course, pandemics. So in 1907, you have the Office of the International D'Hygiene Publique. They established themselves again, as I said, as an international group that is regulating what is happening within Europe and definitely within the rest of the world, particularly the colonial world, right? So they would head and lead, just like the World Health Organization, because we take the lead from them. That is the first body that is really established for us to do the same. In 1921, coming off of the League of Nations, which emerged after World War I, tantamount to the United Nations after World War II. You have, coming out of that body, the League of Nations, you have the Legal Health Organization. And of course, in 1945, you have the World Health Organization developing, right? And this emerging as a result of World War II. So you see major crises and major epidemics driving the world to come together to establish systems that could protect them. The Rockefeller Foundation is an organization that should be recognized for the work that it did on the international stage and within the colonial world. They focused on tropical diseases, on colonial efforts, and they were very, they were very instrumental in supporting colonial territories in the development of their health systems. In 1913, for instance, the International Health Commission was established. They established an International Health Commission. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation is a philanthropic organization headed and headquartered in the United States. And of course, it's from the Rockefeller family, extremely wealthy, and they, of course, created this foundation focusing on healthcare and the control of diseases and identification and research into diseases across the world. And so in the 1930s, they established the International Health Commission or Board. And they were represented in 52 countries and all continents and 29 islands across the world. They, in fact, established the Trinidad Regional Virus Laboratory, which is the image that you see here in Trinidad in 1954. 53, 54 is when, they came and they started to do work. The Trinidad Regional Virus Laboratory is the precursor to CAREC, the Caribbean Epidemiological Center. And then, of course, that turned into CARPHA, right? The Caribbean Public Health Association, which was, very much front and center in this fight against COVID in the Caribbean. So the Rockefeller Foundation, they set up this Trinidad Regional Virus Laboratory, and they did a lot of work actually in the region. They helped they found, actually, they discovered some new diseases in Trinidad. the Mayaro virus, the Oropouche virus, testing mosquito vectors and so forth, and taking blood serums and testing them, and discovering new diseases, because that was one of the things that they did, not only attacking old diseases, but working and trying to find new diseases, tropical diseases, as they call them, that would that they could try to help find cures for. Okay, so their work was significant in this period, well known. And of course, you know, they were involved in public health and environmental sanitation. And in 1916, we have the first school of hygiene and public health established at the Johns Hopkins University. So we see development over time of colonial medicine, and we see investment by outside bodies, not just governments, okay, and international organizations developing, philanthropic organizations investing as well. Okay, here's the Rockefeller, one of their field stations in the River Swamp, in Bush in the river. And to get to the field station, you had to take a boat. So they did fascinating work in the Caribbean, and definitely in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, in terms of decolonization, which is the movement towards independence, nationalistic movements, anything that has to do with the breakup of empire, separating yourself from the imperialists, your mother country, that's decolonization. Let's look at what impact that had on healthcare. So indigenous healthcare, of course, we note that usually missionaries would have cared for the indigenous groups. They focused on European physicians would have focused on Europeans and sometimes leaders of the tribal groups. So they would offer to assist, for instance, the caciques, right? They would offer to assist whoever was in charge, the village king, and help them with their medicine in exchange for them not killing them on site, right? Sometimes. So indigenous care eventually, as I said initially, it's not about the indigenous people. It's about the Europeans, it's about the white people, and sometimes they would offer care. But again, it was about supporting the labor force, right? Tropical medicine initiatives, as I said, they weren't focused on their health. But during the 1930s, we have rumblings of decolonization, and critics, major critics of imperialism, began to come to the fore. Not that there weren't critics before, but they really became forceful. What they focused on, these anti-imperialists, was the poor sanitary conditions of the indigenous people. These were blamed on imperialism. You weren't spending enough, you weren't helpful enough. And so we do see more efforts to invest in public health and disease control in the decolonization period, simply for the imperialists to look good. So they started to spend money on sanitation, on slum clearance, all sorts of things you find, and of course, public health care. Okay, but medicine it's as I said, we're trying to cement or at least really assess this concept of medicine as a tool of empire. Foucault says that, and you know, one of the major philosophers and medical scientists of the day, right? He says, these institutions of normative coercion exercise a moral authority over the individual by explaining individual problems and providing solutions for them. In this sense, we would say that medicine and religion exercise, this is the important part here, a hegemonic authority, because their coercive character is often disguised and masked by their normative involvement in the troubles and problems of individuals. They are coercive, they're normative, and also voluntary. This is so important. It speaks to how medicine could be used as a tool of empire. This idea that, you know, it isn't coming at you in an aggressive manner. When you see the invading forces, if in a military advance, you know imperialists are coming to take over, right? They are coming to conquer. Medicine, however, comes very subtly. It's coercive. It's seductive. It tells you, listen, the only way for you to heal and to be healed is to go by this biomedical practitioner dressed in white with a European accent with white skin. He is going to heal you. He's going to help you. It becomes ordinary for you to, reject your traditional medical practices and just embrace the colonial medicine. I mean, the Western imperialists. It becomes, you then have to hide, for instance, the bush medicine you're taking. You wouldn't go to them and say, listen, when they ask you, what are you taking? Have you taken anything? And you're lying and you'll say, no, when you go to the doctor's office. No, you're not taking anything, but you drink your bush tea. You take your the lock, right? The mixture, the concoction that your grandparents mix up and say, drink this for the cold. You took that. But you wouldn't tell them because, again, it isn't acceptable. It isn't something that is seen as right to do. And that is because we've been taught this by the Western medical tradition. That's inferior. That's wrong. There's always this association of wrong. Okay. And it is different because you have to, you see it differently in other societies. In traditional Chinese medicine, they're preserving, in China, they're preserving traditional Chinese medicine. You could actually go to the traditional Chinese medical department in the hospital. That's tantamount to going to the bush medicine department in Port of Spain General Hospital. That would be unheard of for us, right? We would scoff and laugh at that. But you have other countries and other, societies and civilizations that are not dependent on the Western medical tradition solely, embracing their traditional medicine. So it can be done, and there's value to it. Okay, here we have again, just to speak to the fact of medicine being used as a tool of civilization. Ronald Ross, who's a malariologist, he says it strikes down not only the indigenous, he talking about malaria, barbaric population, but with still greater certainty, the pioneers of civilization, the planter, the trader, the missionary, and the soldier. It is therefore as the principal and gigantic ally of barbarism. It has wielded an entire continent, an entire continent from humanity, the immense and fertile tracts of Africa. So clearly they see disease as a means of keeping back civilized forces. And so their medicine is going to go forth and help civilize. So again, it is going to, be used as this tool of civilization. So it is clear as we close that colonial medicine is a significant thing for us to understand, especially as former colonial people, post-colonial people. We tend to believe that the biomedical system is it. We've accepted it wholeheartedly. And my argument isn't necessarily that it shouldn't be accepted, but we have to see it within context that it was used as a tool of empire, and our traditional medical practices, our alternative medical practices, they should not simply be negated because we were taught something else. That's not to say science shouldn't be dominant. That's not to say that the biomedical tradition has done well, but we're seeing, unfortunately, that in some ways it hasn't worked. And people are turning back to alternative medical practices when maybe embracing both would have seen a stronger system. But what it certainly did do is to undermine the identity of colonial people and to leave us always on the back foot. We're always in the defensive position. We're always in that subordinate position. We're always in the position where we are learning from the imperialists even today. Those that are advancing in medicine in major ways, it will hardly be within post-colonial centers. Of course, there are economic issues related to that as well. But it speaks to the fact that medicine is a tool of empire. And when we examine colonial medicine, it continues to be so. Okay, so I'm going to end here. If you have any questions, you know how to contact me. We will move on to the next lecture in due course. Thank you.